Imagine you are just freezing to death in the pitch black water of the Atlantic Ocean. You are violently shivering. You're desperately treading water these massive swells. And you are handcuffed to the unconscious body of the police inspector who just arrested you.
Wow. Yeah.
Right. And you actually just saved this man's life. But, with absolute certainty that if the two of you survive the night, the very system this inspector represents is going to utterly ruin yours.
Oh, without a doubt.
It's going to strip you of your freedom, your new marriage, your future, everything. And that is the exact, just agonizing moral trap that was sprung on listeners sitting in their living rooms on a Sunday evening in 1939.
It's such a visceral setup, It forces you to immediately ask yourself what you would do in that freezing water. Like, do you let the cop slip beneath the waves and just watch your problems sink to the bottom of the ocean?
Which is tempting, right? I mean, human nature.
Right. Totally tempting. Or do you haul him up, bind your fate to his, and trust that somehow doing the right thing will be rewarded by a universe that, frankly, hasn't shown you much mercy up to this point?
Welcome to another deep dive. Today we are immersing ourselves in a truly remarkable artifact from the golden age of radio. We're taking a trip courtesy of Chesterton Radio, which is, and I just love that wonderful atmospheric little station broadcasting at a commercial street in Atchison, Kansas.
Yeah, it's such a gem.
They dedicate themselves to preserving these incredible broadcasts, and they've given us this pristine transcript of an original 2-part radio drama. It's titled Escape from Tomorrow.
And it was broadcast on the legendary program called The Silver Theater, which is a big deal.
A huge deal. And we aren't just going to recap a thriller today for you, though, the plot itself is a complete masterclass in suspense. We're going to explore how classic storytelling balanced this gritty, Depression-era realism with profound moral dilemmas.
And also the incredibly surreal experience of having all of that high-stakes drama interrupted by a smooth-voiced announcer trying to sell you a 62-piece set of forks and knives.
Yes. The silverware. We are definitely getting into that. So, okay, let's unpack this, because looking closely at early 1939 media means looking at an America that is really holding its collective breath, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. You really have to put yourself in the mindset of the audience sitting there listening. The country is still shaking off the lingering, just bitter frost of the Great Depression. It's 1939.
Right. They aren't totally out of it yet.
Exactly. And at the exact same time, people are listening to their radios and they are hearing the distant, terrifying rumble of gathering storm clouds over in Europe.
World War II is right on the horizon.
Right on the horizon. So listeners craved escapism desperately, but they were also, too bruised by a decade of economic hardship to swallow purely fluffy fairy tales. They couldn't just do the purely happy stuff anymore.
Yeah, they needed something with teeth.
Right. They needed stories that wrestled with the unreliability of justice, the coldness of institutions, and the very concept of everyday working-class providence.
Which makes the Silver Theater the perfect delivery mechanism for that specific blend of, grit and glamour. Because this wasn't some shoestring production being broadcast out of a garage somewhere.
Oh, no, not at all.
This was a massive Hollywood machine. We're talking about a show directed by Conrad Nagel, who was practically Hollywood royalty.
He was a founder of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, just to give you an idea of his clout.
Yeah, exactly. He brought an incredible level of prestige to the radio. And for Escape from Tomorrow, they brought in absolute heavyweights. I'm talking John Garfield and Andrea Leeds playing our main characters, Dan and Wilma Morgan.
John Garfield's casting here is particularly vital to understanding the tone of the whole thing. Garfield was the patron saint of the cynical, working-class anti-hero.
Oh, completely.
He always played the guy from the streets who was tough on the outside, deeply wounded on the inside, and just constantly being backed into a corner by a society that really didn't care about him.
So when audiences heard Garfield's voice coming through the static of their Philco radios, they instantly knew, right? They knew they were getting a story about a guy fighting a rigged system.
Exactly. It was shorthand for the audience. And the writers, Gene Town and Graham Baker, they waste absolutely no time putting Garfield's character, Dan, in that exact corner.
Right. We open high over the Atlantic Ocean. It's a commercial flight from Nassau in the Bahamas, heading back to New York. And you have to remember, flying in 1939 wasn't like hopping on a jet today.
Oh, not at all. It was noisy. It was rough.
Yeah, the cabins weren't pressurized like ours. You felt every single bump of turbulence. And it was a luxury really reserved for the wealthy. And here are Dan and Wilma Morgan, supposedly newlyweds on their honeymoon.
Wilma is terrified of the turbulence. She's clutching Dan's arm, dreaming out loud about a quiet little house in New Jersey with a picket fence.
And Dan is soothing her, playing the confident new husband. But the tension in his voice, which Garfield plays so well, it betrays this massive secret.
Because the honeymoon is a total facade. It is a desperate flight from the law. Dan is secretly on the run, and sitting just a few seats away in that vibrating, noisy cabin is Inspector Thomas McLaughlin. They call him Mac.
And Mac has, quietly and without alerting the flight crew or the other passengers, already placed Dan under arrest.
It's such a brilliant setup.
I love the mechanics of it. The audience is immediately thrown into the deep end, trying to figure out why this guy from 42nd and Broadway, who sounds like he belongs behind the wheel of a yellow cab, is flying out of a tropical paradise in handcuffs.
And the backstory we get is fascinating because Dan actually is a taxi driver. A few weeks prior, the notorious Morelli gang jumps into his cab. He drives them to the Eastern National Bank, waits idling at the curb, and then drives them across the bridge to Jersey.
But Dan claims he had zero idea they were robbing the bank of $60,000. He thought he was just doing a standard fare.
Right. But later that night, one of the gang members tracks him down, hands him a thick envelope, and says, basically, there's your split, keep quiet.
And this is where I push back a little on Dan's character. Because if Dan is so terrified of the Morelli gang, and if he's supposedly this street-smart guy from Broadway, why did he even accept the envelope of cash?
It's a great question.
Doesn't that make his whole innocent taxi driver routine a bit naive? Like a known mobster hands you cash and you just take it?
Well, Dan makes the fatal error of opening the envelope first. He sees $5,000 in cold cash, and panic sets in. He knows the mob now views him as complicit, like a loose end they might tie up.
Sure, but still.
And he knows the cops are looking for the getaway driver, so he takes the money, grabs Wilma, and flees the country to get married in Nassau, hoping distance will just erase the crime.
That's so naive.
Oh, that naivety is exactly what makes the next phase of the story so tragic. His worldview is fractured. He is street smart about the immediate danger of a man with a gun, right? But he is entirely naive about the abstract machinery of the law.
Oh, that makes sense. He thinks sin and guilt are geographical problems.
Exactly. He believes that if he physically relocates to Nassau, the moral and legal taint of the dirty money will simply wash off in the tropical sun. He doesn't understand that the justice system views his acceptance of the cash, regardless of why he took it, as active, willing complicity.
Which brings us back to Inspector Mac. Mac tracks him down to Nassau, and the way Mac handles the arrest tells you everything you need to know about him. Mac doesn't kick the hotel door down. He doesn't cause a scene.
No, Mac is this world-weary, honorable, almost paternal figure.
He actually stood up with Dan and Wilma as a witness at their wedding in the Bahamas, just to keep Wilma from realizing her new husband was a wanted man. It's wild.
It is wild. Mac serves as the anchor of institutional authority, but he possesses a deeply personal sense of honor. He wants Dan to do the legal thing, which is turn state's evidence.
And for you listening, turning state's evidence meant formally testifying in open court against the Morelli brothers in exchange for immunity.
Right. Mac guarantees that if Dan helps put the mobsters away, the state will protect Wilma and clear Dan's name. But Dan refuses. He knows the state cannot protect them from mob retaliation. The Morellis will find them.
So you have this incredibly claustrophobic dynamic happening on the plane. You've got these whispered negotiations happening over the drone of the airplane engines. The newlywed wife is completely oblivious in the next seat. The cop is pressing the criminal.
The tension is just ratcheting up.
And then the natural world decides to intervene and render all of their human laws completely irrelevant. The plane hits a massive, unexpected storm front. The motors start to ice up.
The audio production here, if you listen to the original Chesterton Radio broadcast, it would have been breathtaking for 1939. We are talking about the sheer power of the theater of the mind.
Oh, yeah. No visual effects to rely on.
Exactly. The Foley artists in the studio would be working furiously. They'd be rattling these large sheets of tin to simulate thunder, using mechanical wind machines, creating the terrifying sputter of the failing airplane engines.
It sounds like a locked room mystery, except the room is falling out of the sky into the ocean.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
The pilot realizes they are going down, and he makes this desperate, controlled crash landing right into the huge swells of the Gulf Stream.
It flips the entire narrative on its head. In the cabin, Mac held all the power. He had the badge, the authority, the backing of the whole state of New York. But the moment that fuselage hits the freezing water and starts taking on the Atlantic, that power dynamic is obliterated.
Because there is no jurisdiction in the ocean, the crash acts as a great equalizer. It strips away all societal titles. They aren't cop, suspect, or wife anymore. They are just biological organisms fighting a terrifyingly indifferent force of nature.
It really forces every character's underlying philosophy out into the open. And this is where we really begin to understand Dan's worldview. Because throughout the ordeal, Dan frequently refers to his deep, almost superstitious faith in what he calls the guy who fixes things.
Yeah, that phrase is so important to this story.
I find that phrase so compelling. The guy who fixes things. He's talking about God, obviously, but not in any traditional, pious, religious sense.
No, not at all. It is a working-class, street-level interpretation of divine providence. And to really unpack this, you have to look at the philosophy of the English writer G.K. Chesterton.
Oh, this is right in the wheelhouse for Chesterton Radio.
Exactly. Chesterton frequently wrote about this paradox, of the divine revealing itself not in lofty, sanitized theological concepts, but in the gritty, paradoxical, ordinary struggles of working people.
Right. Dan doesn't use church language.
No, he talks about the creator of the universe the same way a guy on 42nd Street would talk about a well-connected ward boss or like a neighborhood fixer. He literally says, I talk to this pal of mine and I say, how's about a word to the guy who fixes things for me?
It's highly transactional, but it's completely sincere at the same time. He believes there is a grand fixer who can pull strings if you just put in a good word. But the ocean tests that theory immediately.
Oh, big time. The plane sinks. The survivors are bobbing in the warm yet totally exhausting waters of the Gulf Stream, and the pilot looks around at the terrified passengers who are clutching the few available life belts.
Because they've tied all the life bolts together to make a sort of raft, right?
Right. And the pilot realizes, with cold mathematical certainty, that there is simply not enough buoyancy to support everyone.
Which brings us to the first major sacrifice of the broadcast. The pilot, demonstrating this stoic, almost unbearable level of ordinary heroism, simply announces that his arms are failing.
Yeah, he commands them not to try to save him.
And he just lets go of his life belt, slipping beneath the water so the remaining passengers have a fighting chance. It establishes the thematic baseline of the entire story. Like, when pushed to the absolute limit, what are you willing to give up to save another human being?
And Dan's test comes immediately after that. Inspector Mack was badly injured during the impact. He's floating there, unconscious, slipping away. Dan has the perfect out here.
He really does. He could just tread water, look the other way, and let the ocean solve all his legal problems.
But he doesn't. Dan grabs the cup. He pulls Mac's head above the swells. And knowing that he might lose his own strength over the long night ahead, Dan takes Mac's heavy police handcuffs, the very tools used to strip him of his freedom, and clicks one cuff onto Mac's wrist and the other onto himself and Wilma.
The symbolism is so rich it practically leaps out of the speaker. Dan physically binds himself to his captor. He repurposes an instrument of captivity into an instrument of salvation.
It's brilliant writing, and Dan has this verbal tick throughout the play, right? He constantly says, bet you my life. It's his go-to catchphrase. But in the water, he stops saying it and starts actually doing it.
He literally wagers his own buoyancy, his own survival, on the moral imperative of keeping this inspector alive.
They endure 10 grueling hours in the water, 10 hours of darkness, singing songs just to keep Wilma awake, listening to the ocean lap against the life belts, until finally, the blast of a ship's horn pierces the fog.
A luxury cruise liner, the Mayfair, spots them and pulls them from the sea. But in the ocean, survival was dictated by sheer willpower and human grace. The moment they are pulled out of that water, they are thrust back into an environment where grace doesn't really exist.
Yeah, the 1939 American judicial machine.
The contrast is intentionally jarring. You have to imagine the sensory shift for the listener at home. From the roaring, terrifying audio landscape of a freezing ocean to the hushed, carpeted elegance of the Mayfair's bridal suite.
The ship's captain is giving Dan his own silk pajamas. The passengers are treating Dan like a conquering hero for keeping the others alive. Wilma is weeping with joy, entirely convinced that the guy who fixes things has orchestrated this miraculous reversal of fortune.
But Mac, wrapped in blankets and recovering from a concussion, he has to shatter that illusion. The badge is back on. He looks at Dan and says, essentially, you saved my life, and you're a hero. But I still have to put you in a cell when we dock.
But Mac has been fundamentally changed by the ocean, too. He experienced Dan's grace firsthand. So Mac tries to bridge the gap between the rigid law and true justice. He makes Dan a concrete, solemn promise.
Right. If Dan will turn state's evidence against the Morellas in a New York courtroom, Mac will use all his influence, all his years of service, to guarantee absolute police protection for Wilma, and he will ensure the prosecutor clears Dan's name. Do you think Mac was foolish to trust the prosecutor here? Or is this just a classic noir trope where the system is always rigged against the little guy?
Well, I actually think Mac is just as naive as Dan is here, just in a completely different direction. Dan believed he could geographically outrun the mob's taint. Mac believes that because he is an honorable man wearing a badge, the bureaucracy he serves will also act with honor.
Ah, right. They're both completely wrong about the systems they place their faith in.
Exactly. But Dan trusts Mac. He agrees to the deal, and they head back to New York.
Which brings us to the courtroom scene. And this is where the broadcast taps directly into the prevailing cultural anxieties of the late 1930s.
Audiences during the Depression had developed a profound, hard-earned cynicism regarding institutions. I mean, they had seen banks fail, they had lived through the rampant corruption of Prohibition, and they absolutely did not trust the courts to protect the little guy.
This feeling of being crushed by bureaucracy is a timeless theme that makes this older radio play feel incredibly modern, really.
Yeah.
The writers give the audience exactly what they fear. The prosecutor utterly betrays Mac. He completely ignores the backroom deal.
Yeah, when Dan is on the stand, instead of treating him like a cooperating witness, the prosecutor goes right for the throat. He mocks Dan's heroics in the water. He paints Dan as a willing, greedy accomplice to a $60,000 bank heist.
And Mac is sitting in the gallery, just watching his solemn promise be shredded by a lawyer in a suit. He stands up in open court. He interrupts the proceedings, risking his own career, to yell to the judge that a deal was made, that Dan Morgan's heroism earned him immunity.
And the judge brings the gavel down. He literally tells the courtroom that the law cannot allow itself to, quote, sentimentalize upon the so-called heroics of Dan Morgan.
Sentimentalize. The guy swallowed seawater for 10 hours to keep 10 people alive, and the court writes it off as an emotional inconvenience to their conviction rate. It's infuriating.
The choice of the word sentimentalize is just brilliant writing. It perfectly encapsulates the era's view of the justice system as a heightless, grinding machine. The law is depicted as entirely blind to nuance, incapable of recognizing redemption.
Mac's personal honor is completely impotent against the institutional coldness of the courts. The jury returns a guilty verdict almost immediately. The judge sentences Dan to 15 years in the state penitentiary.
And right as the gavel falls, Wilma collapses in the courtroom. It's a classic melodramatic fainting spell.
Right. And while a fainting woman might feel like a tired trope to us today, in a 1939 radio script, it was actually an incredibly efficient narrative device.
Very much so. You have to remember, Silver Theater was largely targeting women who made the household purchasing decisions for things like, well, silverware.
Right, the sponsors.
So the fainting spell instantly pivots the drama from a legal procedural back to a deeply domestic crisis. When the doctor revives Wilma in the judge's chambers, the devastating reality is revealed: she is pregnant.
The timeline establishes that the baby is due in October. So Dan is facing a decade and a half behind bars, his wife is expecting their first child, and the worst part, because Dan stood up in court and tried to testify against the Morelli gang, the surviving brothers, Joe and Carlo, now have a massive target on his back.
Right, he didn't put them away, but he broke the code of silence. His family is now in mortal danger.
It leads to what I consider the most haunting scene in the entire broadcast. Before they load Dan onto the prison train, Mac pulls a few strings and allows Dan and Wilma a brief moment alone in an empty church.
The sound design here shifts dramatically. It's so well done. After the shouting of the courtroom, you just hear the cavernous echo of the sanctuary and the faint, melancholic sound of a solitary organist practicing in the distance.
Wilma is crying, clinging to Dan. She begs him to pray with her. She wants him to talk to the guy who fixes things.
But Dan's response is just a portrait of complete spiritual collapse. He refuses to pray. He's experiencing a profound crisis of faith. He looks around the church and bitterly says, he fixed things, and how? 15 years.
To Dan's transactional mind, the contract with Providence has been breached. He did the ultimate good deed in the ocean. He trusted the system on land, and his reward is losing his freedom, his wife, and his unborn child.
He feels completely cosmically abandoned.
He walks out with Mac, leaving Wilma alone in the pews. And Wilma does something incredible. She doesn't despair. She looks up and prays for him.
Yeah, she says, you are always the guy who fixes things, and he thinks you've let him down. You've got to help him now without his asking.
It's this incredibly moving moment where she intercedes for a man whose spirit is completely broken.
And that prayer acts as a catalyst for Mac. When Mac escorts Dan away, the guilt is just eating the inspector alive. He knows the system he dedicated his life to has perpetrated a profound evil against a good man.
So in the shadows outside the church, Mac makes a sacred vow. He looks at Dan, a man facing 15 years of hell, and says, "I'll have you out before your kid is born, bet you my life." Wait, he adopts Dan's catchphrase, "bet you my life."
Precisely. By using Dan's words, Mac is stepping into the vacuum left by Dan's broken faith. Mac is voluntarily taking on the role of providence. He is promising to become the human instrument of grace that the system failed to be.
He is going to be the guy who fixes things, even if it destroys him. And that promise isn't just an empty comfort. It sets a literal ticking clock that drives the explosive final act. Here's where it's really interesting, because Mac has until October to tear down the walls of the state penitentiary.
The narrative jumps forward, the leaves are turning, it's October, Wilma goes into labor and checks into St. Stephen's Hospital, but it is not a joyous occasion. She is terrified.
Because the Morelli brothers are still roaming the streets, heavily armed, looking for a way to punish Dan.
Meanwhile, inside the penitentiary, Dan is undergoing a terrifying regression. The injustice and the helplessness have driven him to the brink of insanity. He isn't the noble hero of the Atlantic Ocean anymore, you know. He is a caged, desperate animal.
He manages to secure a smuggled revolver in his cell block. When the warden and Mac come to check on him, Dan pulls the gun on them. He threatens to shoot his way through the guards to leave a trail of bodies just to get to his wife's bedside to protect her.
You see the tragic consequence of institutional failure here. When the law fails to protect the innocent are forced to abandon their morality just to survive. Dan is willing to commit actual murder to throw away whatever soul he has left to fulfill his primal duty as a father and a protector.
The tension in that cell is just suffocating. But Mac doesn't draw his weapon. He doesn't call the guards. He smoothly tricks the warden into authorizing a transfer for Dan to the hospital wing under Mac's personal supervision.
And the second they are clear of the cell blocks and the iron bars, Mac drops the bombshell. He didn't just get a temporary hospital pass. He reveals he spent the last several months pulling every political string, cashing in every favor he had in the city, and he actually secured Dan's parole.
Mac kept his vow. Against impossible bureaucratic odds, he fixed it. He tells Dan, "You're paroled in my custody, so we're getting out of here and down to that hospital right now."
The emotional whiplash for the audience is intense. One minute you think Dan is going to the electric chair for shooting a warden. The next minute he's a free man racing through the streets of New York in a police cruiser to see his child being born.
They arrive at St. Stephen's Hospital. Dan sprints up to the maternity ward. And the writers introduce a brief moment of brilliant, tension-breaking comedy here.
Yes, Dan is pacing the waiting room floor alongside another terrified, expectant father, a Mr. Olafson. They're trading this nervous banter, staring through the thick glass of the nursery window at rows of newborns in their bassinets.
But the audience knows something Dan doesn't. The local evening papers just hit the stands, and they printed the news of Dan's miraculous parole.
Right. The Morello brothers read the paper. They know exactly where Dan is going. While Dan is laughing with Mr. Olafson, Joe and Carla Morelli are walking through the hospital doors with loaded guns.
They corner him right there in the waiting room. It is the ultimate confrontation. The mobsters pull their revolvers, aiming straight at Dan's chest. They tell him his luck has run out and order him to say his prayers.
Now, think back to the Nassau scene. The old Dan Morgan would have tried to bargain. He would have offered them money or tried to run down the hallway.
Right, but the ocean changed him. He doesn't beg. Instead, Dan looks over his shoulder at the large glass window of the nursery. He realizes there are dozens of innocent babies sleeping in bassinets right behind him.
What's fascinating here is how Dan uses the mob's own cold calculus against them. He turns the glass wall of the nursery into an acoustic and visual tripwire.
It's like a high-stakes game of chess, where Dan intentionally traps his own king to protect the pawns.
That's a great analogy. He calmly points out to the hitmen that if they fire their heavy-caliber revolvers at him where he stands, the bullets will pass through his body, shatter the glass, and slaughter the infants.
And he knows the Morellas are ruthless, but they aren't stupid. Killing a mob informant is business. Massacring newborns in a hospital ward will bring the wrath of every cop, politician, and citizen in the state down on their heads.
It's a brilliant tactical move. The Morellas realize he's right. They can't shoot him in front of the glass, so they give him a countdown. They order Dan to step away from the nursery window, to walk over and stand flat against a solid brick wall at the end of the hallway so they can execute him cleanly.
This is the culmination of Dan's character arc. The man who once thought he could buy his way out of a moral crisis with a $5,000 envelope is now faced with the ultimate cost.
He has his freedom, his wife is down the hall, but to save the lives of strangers' children he has never met, he must willfully walk to his own execution.
Dan agrees. He steps away from the safety of the glass. He walks to the solid wall. He puts his back against the brick. The countdown reaches its end. The mobsters raise their guns to fire. And in that microsecond, Inspector Mac bursts through the stairwell doors.
Mac doesn't have time to draw. He doesn't have time to shout a warning. He simply throws his body across the hallway, stepping directly in front of Dan just as the Morellas pull their triggers.
Mac absorbs the fatal volley of bullets meant for the taxi driver. The backup police officers rushing up the stairs behind Mac instantly return fire, gunning down the Morelli brothers in the corridor. But wait, didn't Mac actually cause this final shootout? By dragging Dan to the hospital without a police escort, didn't he inadvertently create the very danger he died trying to prevent?
That is the tragedy of Mac's character. He is an imperfect instrument of providence. He fixed the legal problem, but he couldn't outrun the street reality. The sound of the gunfire echoes and fades. The nurses are screaming.
Dan drops to his knees on the linoleum floor, pulling Mac into his arms. Dan is completely devastated. He looks at this old cop bleeding out and says, "Mac, you crazy fool, you walked right into it."
And Mac, with his dying breath, gives this heartbreaking, self-deprecating smile and whispers, "I always was a cop who busted in at the wrong time, lad."
The irony is profound. Mac busted in at the exact right time.
Thematically, this is the ultimate manifestation of the Chestertonian ideal we discussed earlier. Mac became the physical embodiment of providence. The state failed Dan. The courts failed Dan. But Mac balanced the cosmic scales through a supreme act of ordinary heroism.
He fixed Dan's legal status, he eliminated the threat of the mob, and he paid the invoice with his own life. He truly bet his life, and he lost it to win Dan's future.
Right after Mac closes his eyes for the last time, the swinging doors of the delivery room open. The doctor walks out into the bloody hallway. Dan looks up trembling and asks if it's a boy or a girl.
The doctor smiles and says it's a healthy baby girl, a girl they can name after Wilma. Dan is left holding the weight of it all. He has his daughter, he has his freedom, but he knows it was entirely purchased by the blood of his captor-turned-savior.
It leaves the listener completely emotionally drained. The themes of sacrifice, systemic corruption, and the terrifying weight of keeping a promise are woven so tightly into those final minutes. It is a masterpiece of audio pacing.
It really is. Now, I want to pull the camera back a bit, because to truly appreciate this story, we have to look at the bizarre and charming way it was packaged for the audience. Put yourself in that 1939 living room for a second.
Okay.
You've just heard a man offer his life in a bloody shootout to protect a room full of babies. You've listened to an old, honorable cop die on a hospital floor. Your heart is racing. You might have tears in your eyes. And then, seamlessly, without missing a single beat, a buttery, sophisticated voice comes through the radio speaker and says, "And now, a word about the leisurely, orderly living of the 1890s.
It is one of the most surreal psychological whiplashes in the history of broadcasting. The intense, fatalistic grit of the crime drama is abruptly wrapped in the luxurious, high-society velvet of commercial advertising for the International Silver Company.
Can you imagine watching an intense, gritty, modern crime thriller, and right after a character gets shot, the lead actor steps out of character to sell you a 62-piece set of forks and knives? It's wild.
We have to talk about the announcer, John Conti. He steps in right over the metaphorical body of Inspector Mac to pitch the 1847 Rogers Brothers silver plate. Specifically, he is pushing a pattern called Lovelace.
He uses these incredibly evocative descriptions, talking about its shimmering orange blossom motif and how it evokes the grace of great ladies riding sedately in carriages.
To modern ears, it sounds borderline absurd. We are used to commercial breaks, but this was integrated right into the fabric of the show. To understand why this worked, you have to look at the economics and the psychology of the era. The announcer is offering a single, solid, silver plate setting for $16.75.
Which in 1939, as the country was still clawing its way out of the Depression, $16.75 was a massive amount of money. For many working-class families listening to the broadcast, that was a week's wages.
Picture the American housewife listening to this broadcast. She might be sitting in a drafty house, darning socks, stretching a cheap cut of meat to feed her family for 3 days. The drama she just listened to validated her fears about crime, corruption, and the harshness of the world. But the advertisement offers the cure.
Exactly. The broadcast sells you the terror of the modern world and then immediately sells you the aspirational antidote, absolute domestic tranquility, and upward mobility. They even pitched a budget payment plan, reassuring the listeners that they could buy a complete 62-piece service out of income, just like they would buy a piece of furniture or a fine rug.
The ads actually serve as a psychological breather for the audience. It grounds the listener, pulling them out of the blood-soaked hospital hallway and gently placing them into a daydream of a beautifully set dining room table.
Conrad Nagel, the host and director, uses this transitional phrase that I absolutely love. To shift from the play to the ads, he lowers his voice and says, "The lights are being dimmed, and the silver curtain is rising."
The silver curtain is rising. It is a brilliant metaphor. It acts as an ironclad boundary between the harsh, unpredictable reality of Dan Morgan's life and the safe, gleaming, predictable dream of the sponsor's world. But what's truly fascinating is how, at the very end of the broadcast, they intentionally blur those boundaries.
After the silverware pitch is done, Conrad Nagel brings the stars, John Garfield and Andrea Leeds, out in front of the silver curtain for a curtain call. And they instantly drop character to engage in a masterclass of Hollywood cross-promotion.
This was the peak of the studio system. The studios allowed their stars to appear on radio programs like Silver Theater specifically for this synergy. Nagel casually mentions to the millions of listeners that John Garfield can currently be seen in the Warner Brothers picture. They made me a criminal.
It's a very deliberate plug, because that film features Garfield playing an almost identical character, a tough guy wrongly accused, fleeing the law.
Right, and Nagel also promotes Garfield's upcoming role in Juarez alongside heavyweights like Paul Muni and Bette Davis. And he doesn't leave Andrea Leeds out. He plugs her upcoming film, The Real Glory, starring opposite Gary Cooper.
But then they take it a step further. Garfield and Leeds actually start bantering with the announcer about the silverware itself. It is a complete shattering of the fourth wall.
Andrea Leeds leans into the microphone and cheerfully claims that she was so sold on international sterling during her last radio appearance that she actually went out and bought a complete set for her own home.
And Garfield, the guy who just 5 minutes ago was sobbing over a dead cop's body, chimes in, saying that he and his wife are huge fans of the silver too. He even drops Dan's catchphrase, saying, "Bet you my life it's good silver." It's wild.
It tells us everything about the intimacy of the radio medium. These actors weren't just distant images on a screen. They were voices inside the listeners' homes. They were guests in the living room.
The audience trusted them to deliver a heart-stopping performance. And because of that parasocial bond, the sponsors bet real money that the audience would also trust their product recommendations. So what does this all mean? We've traveled from a terrifying plane crash in the freezing Atlantic through a corrupt and cynical courtroom into the violent, bloody halls of a maternity ward, all culminating in a cheerful pitch for beautifully pierced orange blossom silverware.
When you synthesize the historical context, the commercialism, and the narrative, you realize why these stories endure. Escape from Tomorrow is undeniably a product of 1939, but the core mechanics of the human heart haven't changed. The play forces us to confront the fact that systems, whether it's a 1939 courtroom or a modern bureaucracy, are inherently flawed and often blind.
But it also argues that individual people possess the terrifying, beautiful capacity to step into that void and provide grace. It's a profound reminder of the power of a promise.
When Max said, "Bet you my life," he wasn't using a figure of speech. He was writing a blank check with his own soul, and the universe cashed it. The story tells us that ordinary people, like a cynical cop or a terrified cab driver, can become the providence that others so desperately need.
It proves that the theater of the mind requires an active morality from the audience. This artifact from Chesterton Radio proves that the art of storytelling, relying purely on dialogue, sound, and imagination, has a timeless ability to make us reflect on our own moral choices.
You can't just passively watch explosions on a screen. You have to actively build the freezing ocean in your mind. You have to actively weigh Dan's decision to step away from the nursery glass. The lack of visuals makes the moral weight infinitely heavier.
It leaves you questioning your own capacity for ordinary heroism. Would you repurpose your handcuffs to save the man who arrested you? Would you stand in front of a bullet for a friend?
Which leaves you with one final, lingering thought to mull over. Mac kept his promise. He got Dan out of prison. But he had to absorb the violence of the world to do it. Dan is free and his daughter is born, but he has to live every single day of his new life knowing the price that was paid for it. It makes you wonder, did Dan actually escape from tomorrow, or did Mac simply pay the ultimate price to buy tomorrow for him?
Oh, that is a question that will echo in your mind long after the silver curtain falls. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I highly encourage you to seek out the original audio preserved by Chesterton Radio. turn off the lights, listen to those voices in the dark, and we will catch you next time.